Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sorry for the weird arrangement. There are some extra handouts over there, and feel free we're going to be angled in this direction, and hopefully this works for everyone. Okay, so today's part, we have two parshios this week, Acharei-Kedoshim. There is one theme that is repeated over and over again, and that is a list of activities, of intimate activities, of sexual activities, which are prohibited by the Torah. And it's most of it is discussing different forms of incest. The Torah describes different things of incest. Seems like a funny topic to dive into, but as we'll see, I think we're going to walk away. What I'd like to do is discuss these prohibitions, and through it, I think we're going to walk away. I hope we're going to walk away with a more profound understanding, not of what is prohibited, but of what is allowed, of what how the Torah looks at love and how the Torah looks at marriage, which obviously is a very important topic to think about. And if we have time, what I'd like to do is actually go back to a passage from Sefer Bereshis, to one of the first couples, celebrated couples in the Torah, and that is Avram and Sarah, and see some very interesting themes, which, in light of what we're learning today, will hopefully become clear. So that's my agenda today. Let's jump in, okay? So first I want to just begin, because some people ask whenever a topic like this is discussed, and that is there is a Mishnah, somewhat well-known Mishnah in Meseches Chagiga. It is one of the tractates of the Talmud, which says, Ein darshin ba'arayas b'shalosh, that it is forbidden to discuss anything to do with what sounds like. It says, arayos is a general term that is used for sexual prohibitions. The Torah says it is forbidden to discuss that in a group of three or more. Why 3 or more? And the Gemara indicates that if, let's say, one student asks a question, let's say there's 3 students and one teacher, and one student asks a question, and the teacher starts discussing with that one student, the 2 others may start their own conversation, not really listen to what's going on, and come to their wrong conclusions. That's what it seems. That's what it sounds like. What the Gemara is saying. The question is this a general prohibition? Is this not? So, my introduction is very technical. I just want to read to you a little section from someone known as the Meiri. The Meiri is one of the classic commentators on the Talmud. He actually takes the same approach as Rashi, which I think we're all more familiar with. Just that Rashi is very terse, and the Meiri spells out what he means. But this is how I'm just going to read it in English, and he explains what the parameters of this prohibition are, and we'll see what he says. He says the explanation of the matter regarding arayos. And here are the key words, which do not have explicit mention in the Torah. So he immediately qualifies it. It is not to say that you are not allowed to talk about this topic in general in a public setting. This is not about what some misconstrue this to be about modesty, which of course is a value. We are sensitive to the words that we use, even if we know what things mean. We want to be very as modest as possible, and that is true, but that's not what this prohibition is about. It's not about making sure we don't talk about these things in a public setting. Rather, it's about the arayos, the prohibited activities, which are not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. Because what? If one will teach to 3, one will be going back and forth with the teacher, and 2 remaining will go back and forth among themselves, and they will not pay attention to the words of the teacher, and will make a mistake in ruling to permit erva. They will make a mistake, and they will permit something which is really forbidden, but because A, it's not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, and B, they're having a discussion, but they're not paying such good attention because they're having a side conversation, they're going to permit something which is otherwise prohibited. But one might teach 2, fine, etc., etc. My point in mentioning this is just to in case someone would be bothered by, again, sometimes people have quoted this Mishnah to me in the context of such a class of saying that it is forbidden, prohibited to talk about anything to do with sexuality or sexual relations in a public setting. Again, we do have a value of modesty, but at the same time, there is no such prohibition when talking about things which are well known and understood by all. It is regarding particular laws which are not so well known. There is a danger that people will misunderstand things. We're not talking about obscure things. We're going to talk about general categories, okay? And that's our focus today. So, bottom line is, what I'm trying to tell you is, rest assured, we're not doing something that is prohibited. Okay, fine. With that in mind, let's now talk about arise. Let me ask you a question. And I think I may have, in a different setting, maybe some of you were there, but talk about, once asked a similar question, so let's ask this question, and that is, that if an alien were to come down from space, aliens exist, don't exist, I don't know, who cares? It doesn't bother me as a from a Jewish perspective theology, it doesn't matter. But that's not the topic today. And let's say an alien comes down, and a very curious alien, and says, I've noticed that in virtually every society in the world, Eastern world, Western world, there is a taboo against incest. People will not marry, a brother will not marry a sister. Can you explain to me rationally, Mr. or Mrs. Human, Miss Human or Mr. Human, what the explanation is? Like, why? Why is it that this is the case? And the alien will stop you. And don't tell me it's about genetics, because I did my research, and I know that you didn't know anything about genetics until, I don't know, a little while ago. And this was something which was taboo for virtually almost every society for thousands of years. Why? Why is that the case? What would you answer?
Wait, is this the same case with two cousins?
There are cousins' cases are typically is going to be permitted with a cousin. But let's talk about brother and sister. The alien only wants to know about the brother and sister. But yes, I'm not going to go into the whole list. There's aunts. I mean, it's brother and sister is the simplest, most straightforward. Would you have a rational explanation? Most you'd say is like, ugh. Like, it's like, ew. Like, that's what you would answer. But that's not going to do it for the alien. The alien is a bright, intelligent alien and wants you to give a rational explanation. If he asks you, or she, I don't know, whatever. If the alien asks you about, adultery, you'll say, yeah, that's stealing. Like, there's a relationship, there's a commitment, and there's a breach of that commitment. Okay, that's logical. We get it. But how would you explain something like a brother and sister not being able to have a relationship? Logically, and not using modern science. I think we would struggle. So let's see, when we think about the prohibited activities, if it's even from the Torah's perspective, there are three categories of different mitzvos that the later commentators, even the Gemara already starts to talk about, the Torah alludes to, and that is, generally we'll talk about two categories. There's what we call mishpatim, which are laws that are we could intuit, or not even necessarily intuit necessarily, but understand if someone explains to us. And there is a category called chukim. Chukim are laws like, the red heifer. The red heifer is a law which is, a person becomes impure, and there's this whole, back in biblical times, not something we deal with today, but basically what you do is you have this cow which was completely red, and you burn it, and you slaughter it, and you burn it, and you take the ashes, and you sprinkle, and the Kohen goes ahead and sprinkles the ashes on the person who came into contact with someone who's impure, and what happens is the person who received the ashes, they become pure. The person who sprinkled the ashes becomes impure. And you're left wondering, that makes no sense. And the Gemara says, yeah, that is a classic example of a chok. That is a classic example of something which is, chok literally means like a decree of God. At some point, sometimes I'll get into a disagreement with my children about what they should or should not do, and sometimes just say, Abba said so. Sorry, end of conversation. And you have the prerogative as, at some point it's over. Like sorry, I'm twice your size and I have my own whatever. I'm fine. But in theory, right, that is what a chok is. A chok is that the king decreed. God is the king. If he decrees, it doesn't mean it's illogical. It just means it's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond the comprehension of the masses. That is the category of chukim. So the question is, maybe we should say that arayos, that this whole category, maybe it's in that category, that all the prohibited sexual, relationships, aside again from adultery, let's say, are all in that category of beyond our comprehension. So let's see how our sages address this. Let's see. So the Gemara in Yoma, one of the tractates the Talmud says, our rabbis taught, you shall perform my judgments. Mishpatim. There's a verse from the Torah, and says the Gemara, this refers to those things that, had they not been written, would seem logical that they be written as laws. So he says this category of judgments, which is in Hebrew mishpatim, that is a category of things that had they not been written, they should have been written, meaning we would understand them on our own. What is included? This includes idolatry. Okay, that's interesting. We'd have to discuss why, but we're not for today. Sexual immorality, murder, stealing, and blasphemy. So very seemingly clearly, the Gemara lists sexual immorality, which we're going to describe as the general prohibition against forbidden relationships, as a mishpat, as something which should be logical, which means that we all need to get an answer. Because the alien is right for asking us a question, because the alien will say, and don't tell me there's no answer. The Gemara in Yoma says, there is an answer. It's something which you should be able to intuit. Right? However, not everyone agrees, and there are different Gemaras which have different implications. The Ramban Nachmanides, writing hundreds of years later, spells this out and says, behold, the arayot, meaning the sexually, the prohibited sexual activities, fall under the category of statutes. In Hebrew, chukim. They are matters decreed by the king. A decree is something that is decided at the king's discretion, for he is wise in the rule of his kingdom, and he knows the need for and purpose of the mitzvah that he is commanding, but he does not tell it to the nation, only to the wisest of his advisors. Okay, so a chok, the Ramban's explanation of a chok is, it is something which is logical, but you and me, we're not going to necessarily understand it. It's beyond our comprehension. Okay, so we already see clearly that there are two views. There are those who say there is no answer. And if someone were to ask why is it that it's prohibited, from a Jewish perspective, you would tell the alien, because God said so. And that's a legitimate answer. It's the same thing you would answer if he says, the alien asks, why is when you sprinkle the blood and sprinkle the ashes, and you'd say it's part of that category. Done. But the Gemara seems to indicate that there is an explanation. So if you want to leave now and you want to say, okay, I'm perfect, I prefer to just say there is no answer. That's fine. You're in good company. The Ramban Nachmanides says there is no answer which will sit well with all of us. However, again, the Gemara says there is a logical explanation. So with that, I want to share with you 3 different approaches. 1 from a classical source, the Rambam, and 2 from very modern and interesting sources. Okay, so let's see what these sources are. Says the Rambam in Mor Nevuchim. The Rambam wrote his book Mor Nevuchim essentially to help curious people who are, I'm literally confused, but I would say curious. People who had questions, people who wanted to understand how the Torah makes sense. And one of the features of this book is that he goes through a number of mitzvos, and he suggests different explanations behind why this is allowed, this is encouraged, this is prohibited, and he addresses this question of arayot, of the prohibitions against certain sexual activities, and he explains it in a very general sense. Let's see what he says. Says the Rambam, the prohibition of arayot, the message in all of them is to limit sexual relations and to convey abhorrence for them and to be satisfied with the very minimum. Okay? Let's pause over here. The Rambam very clearly is seeing in sexual activity, it seems, right? He says, limit sexual relations. He sees in sexual activity something which is, in his words, abhorrent, something which is not, he doesn't have the most positive view, okay? And he says the goal of these prohibitions in general is to give us, the opportunity to engage in a minimum. And the whole of arayot are all one single matter. He says all the prohibitions, whichever prohibition it is, under the whole umbrella of arayot fall under one basic explanation. Okay, and you have to keep in mind, I apologize, we have a class here of, there's 2 men here and many more women. So you have to keep in mind that the Rambam is writing primarily for a male audience, right? So it's going to be like male-centric in terms of who his audience is, the, educated people of his time, about, 700 years ago or so, were men. So he's writing to them, but you just take the same idea and flip it. It's the same idea for women, but again, just who he's addressing a male readership. Okay, he says, for each of these women meaning each of these prohibited women, then the prohibitions which are incestual is a permanent fixture in a man's home. Okay, let's pause again. What that means, and maybe some of you experience this, back in the day, the way that a family would the way things work is that there would be that the grandparents and the children and the grandchildren would live in a house. And if someone was blessed with a long life, then the great-grandparents would also live in the same house. Maybe some of you grew up that way, where a grandparent lived in your home. This was fairly normal. People would live with their family. It was a family home. And whatever, they would work it out. Okay, good, bad, whatever. It is what it is. Now it's like, Zadie's coming to visit, Bubby's coming, it's the whole, it's not like, it'd be strange, it'd be different, it'd be out of the ordinary to live in the same home. But back in the day, this was very common. People lived in a family home. People growing up in downtown Baltimore, everyone tells me, of course, Bobby and Zadie lived in the house. So this was the norm. This is the norm. So he says, when you think about who it is that we are prohibited in engaging with relationships with, these are people who are already naturally in our family home. And again, it wasn't just Bubby and Zadie, it was Bubby and Zadie and the aunt and basically, again, whatever, they would figure it out. Yeah, everyone would sleep on the floor, whatever, it is what it is. Like, they would all live in the same home. So they were around each other all the time, okay? And she is easily found and attainable. It requires no effort to find her. Okay, so basically the people who, again, let's just talk about a sibling. A sibling, you're growing up in the same house, they're there all the time. And therefore they're attainable. Then most people would continually debase themselves with prostitution of them. It doesn't literally mean prostitution as we use it, but basically with sexual activity, since sexual relations with them are completely forbidden, and we are warned. Fine. So let's pause. What he's saying is like this. I'm sorry to keep on pausing, but I just want to make sure we understand. What he's saying is that the reason behind these prohibitions is precisely because these people are so around. Meaning, again, it's not like an aunt's visiting from Arizona. Everyone lives together. The families are all together, and they're always around. And the Torah's ethic, according to the Rambam, is one which tries to limit our engagement in sexual activity. Okay? Therefore, those who are so easily accessible, a brother and a sister and a brother, the Torah says, no, in order to create some level of balance. Right? The Rambam's general view of the world, of our relationship with the physical world, always goes back to Aristotle's golden mean. He is a believer of the ideal, and he believes that most of the Torah is built around this idea that the goal of the Torah is to create a balance. So, for example, the Torah doesn't say we have to fast all the time. It says eat food. But it prescribes certain foods. It says this food yes, this food not. Why? To create balance. Right? The laws of kosher, the Rambam understands more or less the same way. The Rambam says, look, food is something which we have to do. It's a part of nature, but the Torah creates certain restrictions. Don't just grab a cow and eat it. Go through the slaughtering process, go through the salting process. It creates a certain level of distance. It creates a certain level of not everything's accessible. Even in the modern times, we can appreciate this, even though we have so much, we live in Baltimore, we have so much kosher food around, but you go to, Shoppers, whatever they call it now, in Green Spring Shopping Center, and I remember it happening to my child, and we're standing in the checkout line. She was like 4 at the time, and she picks up, of course, these devious, people, what do? They put all the yummy chocolate bars right by the checkout. They know what they're doing, right? And so, of course, the 3-year-old or 4-year-old is going to go and pick it up, Mommy, Daddy, and start furious while the person in front of you is looking for change, and you feel like this pressure. And my child happened to pick up the one kosher, I think it was like gum or something, that didn't have a hechsher on it. And the 4-year-old, it gives me, I say, I'm sorry, honey, it's not kosher. I said, oh, okay. I'm not suggesting that all people who keep kosher have the perfect balance in their lives. No, we know that's not true. But if you want to ask what the purpose is, it's to create that sense of, I could abstain. I don't have boundaries, exactly, perfect word. Boundaries, I'm not going to just, everything comes my way, blah, 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 blah. No, when we travel, it's complicated. Baruch Hashem. It's an opportunity to remember kosher is meant to create some form of boundaries. Beautiful. He says the same idea with the sexual, realm. And there is a notion that those who are so close to us, and therefore so accessible to us, create those restrictions to ensure that a person isn't, just like we're not eating all the time, a person's not engaged in sexual activity all the time. Fascinating. That's the Rambam's approach as to why sexual activity is prohibited with those who we are closest with, precisely because we're, at least back in the day, we're growing up in the same home in order to create those appropriate boundaries, to create a sense of balance in our lives. It's a very interesting approach. It doesn't, and then we could ask, why is it, so that's true for Jews, where does it come from, for those who don't keep the Torah? Okay, whatever, a larger discussion, but that's the Rambam's approach as to why, certain incestual relationships are prohibited. Good? Makes sense? Ish? Yeah? Enough? Okay. So let's now move on to a very different approach. Well, actually, I should say a similar approach in some respects. Something from a man by the name of Rabbi Hillel Zeitlin. Anyone hear of Hillel Zeitlin? Okay. He's a fascinating individual. He was born at the end of the 19th century, grew up in a very observant home, left Orthodoxy, came back to Orthodoxy, and he really became what is known as a leader of what was called neo-Hasidus. It's become pretty trendy these days, but basically people who will take on elements of Hasidic movements, but don't fully embrace the Hasidic life. They love the ideas, but they don't take it all on. He was a poet, he was a philosopher, he was a fascinating individual, wrote some very important works. He lived in Warsaw, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, I believe. He was 71 at the time, and he was killed by the Nazis. And the eyewitnesses say that he was wearing talis and tefillin and clutching a copy of the Zohar at the time when they took his life. Very, very tragic end. But he has some fascinating writings which are very interesting. And I want to read to you what he says. He says like this. He says, and okay, you'll tell me what your reaction is, but let's just read it carefully. He says, if you conduct sexual relations with your sister or with one of the other female relatives listed by the Torah, you offend the sisterliness of your sister. You damage the honor of the relationship with that female relative. I'm going to keep on reading for a second so we can understand what he means. If you approach a woman, and again, if he's talking to men, he'd say, if you're talking to women, he'd say, if you approach a man, it's the same thing, but again, he has also a male audience. If you approach a woman out of desire and sexual attraction, it is not possible that you will continue to relate to her with the proper honor due to her. So he says something very interesting. He says it is incompatible to have a sexual relationship and a purely respectful relationship. The two, if there's a sexual relationship, by definition, it taints the ability to have a fully respectful relationship. The two are incompatible. And therefore he says, if you have a sister or a brother, whoever you're talking to, and that relationship becomes one that is impacted by sexuality, that means that in his worldview, that means there is some objectification. There is something where a person sees someone as perhaps a source, an object of their gratification. By definition, he says, it is going to infringe or taint the ability to properly, fully respect them. That's point number one. Now, let's take that to the nth degree. He says, if we were to realize this view consistently, then there is, meaning, if we were to really accept this, that any sexual relation by definition demeans or takes away from respect, then there is no choice but to arrive at Tolstoy's conclusion concerning celibacy. Not every Jewish source quotes Tolstoy, so that's fun always reading. Okay, but basically Tolstoy was in some ways a born-again Christian. He was a devout person and wrote, literature, but it's literature that seeped in philosophy and theology. And Tolstoy, in his writings, sees sexuality as something which is completely broken, and therefore promotes a view of celibacy, which we know is the Christian view. And Zeitlin is writing, he says, that makes sense. If we're going to take what I said to the nth degree, and we want to have respectful relationships, then remove all sexual relationships. However, he says, but the Torah cannot arrive at such conclusions, for they oppose life and Torah, the living Torah. What he means by that is that God wants us to procreate. God wants the world to be filled with people. And therefore, if we were to promote a world of celibacy, it'd be the end of the world. The world would simply stop to exist if everyone would be celibate. That couldn't work. He says, therefore, the Torah exercised this principle in all its severity, only in those instances where it may exercise it, meaning it limits who this is prohibited with, and then he adds a very interesting insight. After each woman who is prohibited, the Torah gives a fairly clear explanation of the significance of the prohibition. She is your sister. She is of your father's flesh. It is your own nakedness. Meaning, in the Torah, if you were listening closely to this week's Parsha, it says something very interesting and very hard to understand. It says, do not, have a relation with one sister. Why? For she is your sister. It said, don't ever don't knock over the chair, for it is your chair. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. And their commentators grapple with this. It seems like circular phrasing. Don't engage in this relationship with your aunt because she is your aunt. Okay, you're not adding. What does it mean because? It's not saying anything. But according to his interpretation, it says, no, it's saying everything. Because as if to say, in an instance where you are obligated to maintain a purely platonic connection, meaning it is your sister, it is your aunt, it is your brother, whatever, then you are not allowed to conduct sexual relations. You hear what he's saying? He's saying, in other words, what the Torah is saying is, she is your sister or he is your brother. Keep the purity of that relationship. Keep that relationship as untainted as possible. Don't allow anything to get in the way of that. Maintain the purity or the platonic purity of that relationship. Don't taint it with anything that would objectify. Don't taint it with anything that would in any way detract from the purity of that relationship. Right? And that's, so again, his understanding is that the whole rationale behind this prohibition is precisely, if I were to just elaborate a little bit, and that is that, a person, if they have siblings or aunts or whatever, uncles, then there is a natural, loving relationship, hopefully, again, siblings, they fight, we know, but, hopefully a loving relationship between them. And the Torah wants us to maintain that pure, and there's a pure relationship that exists between them. They're brothers, they're sisters, they get along, again, with whatever caveats. But the point is that there should be something so familiar and familial between them, that they're so close and connected and pure. Don't taint those relationships. That the Torah has to say, okay, at least those relationships are going to remain pure. That is Zeitlin's approach. I'm going to turn on the air conditioning while we speak because I'm a little hot. But let me ask you, what are your thoughts? No, don't worry. I'm not going to make it too much cooler. Just 1 degree. Okay. Okay. What are your thoughts? How does that sit? Resonates, not resonates, agree, disagree?
That makes sense. I like that.
Okay.
That's actually what I was thinking before. It changes the relationship. It adds complication to something you don't want to add complication to.
Right. Okay. Right. And that's Island's point. It's that it adds a dimension. Whether he says, he's describing it, but you're from a psychological perspective, it would create a different dynamic, right? And that gets in the way of the relationship. Okay. It's worth noting that this approach is one which clearly takes, I think the modern terminology is it takes a sex negative approach, right? It sees intercourse, it sees that whole relation, the whole dynamic is one which is negative and tainted, by definition. And that's something which, again, there is if we were to go ahead and sketch a philosophical family tree, of this view, it exists. It goes all the way back to the times of the Talmud, and where you have these different viewpoints listed. But there is another view. There's another view which takes a very positive view of sexuality. Okay, within the Torah, the Ramban, for example, for the record, describes. There's a book which many say he wrote, where he describes intimacy as Kodesh Kadashim, holy of holies. That's it's not saying it's permitted. That's like describing it as the most sanctified thing. Like that's obviously a very different approach, right? So there again, these two views, there are different views, but with keeping in mind Zeitlin's approach, I want to share with you something from Professor Leon Kass. Professor Leon Kass is a fascinating individual. He is a professor, I think, at Northwestern, Bible scholar. He's a Jew. He is, I don't know if he's observant, not sure. He writes fascinating commentary on the Torah. Fascinating, insightful things. He comes at it from a very traditional approach, but just like, I don't know, wild insights, very, very, like not wild in the sense like they're off the base, but like just beautiful insights and a beautiful thinker. So he has a piece called The Meaning of Marriage. And before we see the piece, it's worth quoting Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes as follows. He writes about the ancient times. He says, in ancient times, there were marriages, but there was no love. People became man and wife without having ceased to be brother and sister. Again, in the past, there were marriages, but there was no love. People became man and wife without having ceased to be brother and sister. What does he mean by that? What he means by that is something I think we could all understand, and even generationally, things have changed. Our perception of what a person wants out of a marriage has changed dramatically over the past 100 years. Rousseau obviously is before that, but even in his time, he saw a massive change, right? Even the past 100 years, many, not all, but many relationships were very much utilitarian. You know, there was respect, there was kindness. It wasn't that it was bad. It's just the notion of finding like emotional fulfillment and that level of companionship. Some marriages had, but many didn't, and that was normal. People, they got married, and you didn't expect this to be your confidant necessarily. Again, some yes, some no. Nowadays, that would be foreign. It'd be much harder for someone to say, we have a relationship. My closest people are not in my relationship, not in this marriage at all. It's more out of the ordinary. Rousseau is pointing out to even a more dramatic change. He says, back in the day, the relationship was one, there wasn't that sense of love as we know it, as he described it, and certainly as we know it today. And therefore, he argues that what there was people basically, they were family, like a brother and sister. Like a brother and sister. They lived, they were roommates, and there was maybe, again, respect, whatever it was, but it wasn't that sense of romantic love that we would think of today. With that in mind, let's now read what Professor Kass has to say. He says, in ancestry, he really takes, and before you read it, I just want you to prepare ourselves. He takes Zeitlin's perspective and he flips it on its head. He says literally the exact opposite, and you'll see what I mean. In an incestuous union between brother and sister, there is no experience of the other as the truly other. Okay? There is no distance. Okay? No sexual strangeness, no need to overcome fumbling, embarrassment, shame. The inward-looking love of one's own flesh is naked, but is not ashamed. For this reason, the other is taken for granted and approached in tacit expectation of full compliance with one's desires. The other is not easily an object of respect. Let's pause here. What he means is as follows. If my younger brother, who I love dearly, one day became the president of the United States. He was born in Canada. Not happening. Okay, whatever. Let's becomes the prime minister of Canada one day, okay? Would I ever say, at the end of the day, he's my little brother. I'm not going to, you might all say, this is the most incredible person to have ever existed, and I love him, and I respect him, but he's also the little brother. He's the little brother, and I'll never have that sense of oh, wow, he's so amazing. It's just I'm not going to come at it from that. The fact that there is a strangeness, the fact that there is a distance between you and him, as opposed to me and him, is important, right? I always joke, I remember I was at some dinner over here, and there was someone, important communal leader who was being honored, and the person calling him up was just, in modern terms, they were roasting the guy. They were making fun of him about what he did in high school and this and that, and I turned to a rabbi next to me and I was like, I'm so happy I didn't grow up in Baltimore. Had they only known of all the shenanigans I did in high school, no one would take me seriously, you know what I mean? The distance actually creates a sense of that lack of familiarity, actually in that little space of strangeness, actually allows for more respect. It allows for more sense of, there's some mystery over here. I don't know this person. Whereas with my sibling, again, whether they're president of the United States or even if they're not, so often me and my brothers, we'll all make the same decision. And almost know what they're going to do. We share the same allergies. We share the same, we know each other. We know who we are. In his words, there's nakedness but not shame. We're an open book to each other. I get it. I know what they're thinking because we share a whole lot of stuff, upbringing, nature and nurture that we share with each other. And so there is no strangeness, there's no otherness, okay? And because of that, there's no mystery. There's no sense of, who is this? And if there's no mystery, there's no sense of awe. There's no sense of standing back. I know exactly what this is. It's my little schnook brother. I love him. I love you, Shmuley. Okay, but the point is that but it doesn't have that same level of respect. He says, and because of familiarity, there's likely to be contempt. Sometimes, as we all know, it's with family that we have the most difficulty. Right, it's the family that we have the most, interpersonal challenges. The familiarity actually could breed contempt. I know you too well that it doesn't actually allow for any sense of what are you doing? And which you wouldn't say if it's just a stranger who's doing the same exact thing. There's little possibility of awe before the sexual other. Awe before the uncanniness of sexual difference, of the radical interdependence of otherness of the other. Okay, I know he writes some very lofty words. Awe before the uncanniness of sexual complementarity, of the remarkable possibility of mediating the sexual difference, right? In other words, part of the magic of a relationship, he says, is dafka, specifically because you have two others. You have a man and a woman, and they're from two different worlds. As much as they're the same, they may have grown up on the same block, but the point is, there's so much difference, and somehow you're able to overcome that, and that in of itself is a miracle. How does this work? That you could be so different. You didn't grow up in the same home, and you have to negotiate all your spending habits and your this habit and your that and all that stuff, and somehow it's able to work together. Mwah! It's amazing. It's magical. It's wow. It's so incredible, right? That's something that could not exist. That sense of otherness and awe and respect and sense of excitement of overcoming it, none of that would exist if there was to a brother or to a sister, to someone who you're too similar to. Right? He says, and because there is no awe before the sexual other, there is less likelihood of awe. He brings it to God. There's less likelihood of awe before the divine other, capital O, in whose he created them, male and female. Okay? So he sees this as a broad and grand view of this really being a model for our ability to connect to God. Because when we think about our relationship to God, there is no greater other than God. We are mortal, we are flesh and blood, and God is not. God is whatever God is, right? And so in as much as we're able to overcome those differences and to, in that space of difference and separation and mystery, create a sense of awe and create a sense of, throughout your entire life, hopefully there'll be constant uncovering, a constant sense of I never knew that about this person because I'm not so familiar. I don't know them. I can't, as much as someone say, I lived with this person for 75 years, of course I know them really well. Yes, and you may still be surprised. And with a sibling, you also might be. You're not going to come at it the same way. So he took Zeitlin's view and he flipped it on its head. He said, because she is your sister, because she is your aunt, is telling you why you can never have the healthy relationship that the Torah wants. He's saying, no, the sexual tension and dynamic is actually something which creates complication, but it also creates distance and friction, which allows for greater respect and greater overcoming and greater sense of two totally different worlds colliding and coming together, which a relationship which is already so connected and so familiar would not allow for. A very different perspective, and one which is obviously much more positive towards intimacy that Professor Cass suggests. Thoughts? Make sense? Okay, right? You see, so again, two radically different views, right? So we've seen already, just to review, we've seen those who say, we have no way of understanding this, just chalk it up to a chok, whatever, good luck, that's it. And then we have those who say no, and the Ramban, and that's fine. There are those who say no, it could be understood. The Rambam who says it's about balance. You have Zeitlin who takes that step further and says not about, yes, it's about balance, but even more than that. Sexuality, by definition, taints the platonic purity of a relationship, and therefore, in as much as whatever pure relationships we have, we want to maintain. And we need to have children, so God allows for other relationships where, again, they're not predisposed to purity, like those who are not immediate family. And then you have Cass, who says the exact opposite. The ideal is a relationship where there is otherness. The ideal is a relationship where there's strangeness, where there's mystery, where there's distance. The mere fact that it's two human beings who are so different, that is precisely part of the magic of a relationship. And it's those who are too close will not allow the respect and the awe and the reverence that a relationship of siblings would never allow for. And that's why those closest to you are always perpetually forbidden. Okay? Two totally different, I find it to be a beautiful approach. And with that in mind, I want to go back to a section in Bereshis. With that in mind, okay? It's a section from the very first, again, one of the most celebrated relationships, the relationship of Avram and Sarah. And we know that in Sarah's lifetime, there were two instances where she was taken as captive. She was taken as captive one time by Paro and one time by a man by the name of Avimelech, okay? Each passage is its own world unto its own, but we're going to read a couple of psukim from the passage of Avimelech. Now let's remind ourselves what happens. Avram comes to a city and they say, who is this woman? And what does he say? She is my sister. She's my sister. Let's keep that in mind, okay? Vayomer Avimelech. So you have the text in front of you. It's in Hebrew and translated in English. Vayomer Avimelech al Avraham. Mara'isa ki asisa es hadavar hazeh. Avimelech says to Avram, what in the world do you do this to me? You said she was your sister. Because of that, I thought you weren't married. I didn't realize I was committing adultery. I took her as my wife. What does Avram say? Vayomer Avram says, Ki amarti rak ein yiras Elokim b'makom hazeh, v'harguni al dvar ishti. He says, I saw, however he saw, whatever it was that he saw, but he saw through the people, through what they were engaged in. It was not a God-fearing place. And he recognized that they would act, if he would be the spouse, they would just knock him out. They would kill him. For this, okay, you should stop there. That sounds like a pretty good excuse. In other words, he comes to a city, he says, I see this, it's like, it's an immoral society. It's a society which doesn't have any boundaries, and therefore if I'd say it's my wife, you would just shoot me in the head. Okay, so I understand. That makes sense. But then he continues, okay? He says, V'gam, and also, Amna achosi vas avihi, achlo vasimi. He says, in truth, she's actually my half-sister. Okay, whether she's exactly a half-sister or whether it's a niece, whatever, not the point. But she basically says, she actually is my sister. That's a Hilisha, and she became my wife. So Avram says, by the way, she's also my sister. Now, if you were Avimelech, what would you do with that second explanation? Be like, grow up. That's what I would say. I'd say, like, very nice. You got me. Like, what are you getting at? Like, what are you trying to convey over here? And why does, so that's, first of all, like, what's Avram thinking? Is that really a compelling answer? Okay, but the bottom line is you're married. You're married. So what, shkayach, very nice. She's your sister. Like, what is that? How's that helping? But also, why does the Torah record this? Like, what is going on over here? The Torah records this. Strange. What happens after, you see ... because we don't have all the text in front of us. What happens after is Avimelech says, okay, take Sarah, your wife, back. He describes her as Avram's wife. He gives her these gifts, and that's the end of the chapter. The immediate following chapter, chapter 21, says, Vashem pakad es Sarah kasher amar. Sarah was, so to speak, remembered, like God said, Vayas Hashem l'Sarah kasher diber, and God did to Sarah as he announced, and what she conceived, and she had a child. Okay? The Torah then fasts forward very quickly. It doesn't tell us what he was like when he was born, when he was 2, when he was 3. However, when he's 3, Vayigdal hayeled vayigamal. And the child got older, and he was weaned. What does it mean to be weaned? Weaned means that he was nursing, right? And then, usually it's understood by the commentators, he's about 3 years old, and at this point, he is weaned. Vayas Avram mishta gadol bayomi gamelas Yitzchak, and Avram made a great feast on the day that Yitzchak was weaned. Now, let me ask you a question. You don't have to answer this. Okay, I'll just answer it for myself. My children nursed, okay? And when they stopped nursing, we had a regular day. We poured ourselves some cornflakes for cereal for breakfast, and we went on with our day. Avram makes a great feast on the day that his son was weaned. You ever been bothered by this? You ever see this passage? What's going on? Why would Avram make a party on the day that Sarah stops nursing? Who cares? I mean, it's a big deal, don't get me wrong. She can sleep better. I don't know. There's all these beautiful, important things. But like a party, it's such a strange thing. And the truth is, it's not so strange. Historically, historians will tell you that this actually was quite common. That back in the day, they would make parties at the moment that the mother would stop nursing the child. Why would they make them? Specifically in one direction. When a son would stop nursing, they would make a party. Why would they make a party? Anyone want to guess?
Wait, haircut? Is there a connection with the haircut?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's a good connection. But all societies would do this. Not all, but there are societies that would do this. This is normative back in the day.
I think there are a couple things that come to mind for me. One would be that, like, the child was now, had made it through the first 3 years, so was less likely to die as an infant when it would be most common.
Right.
Infants to die young. Also, maybe it's like a separation from his mother for a boy, when he's going to start to be educated as a boy.
Excellent. So both those things are true, certainly, right? We know that the rates of children dying in the first few years back in not even that long ago. We live in a wondrous time where the statistics have changed dramatically, and certainly where we live. So there certainly is a sense of, okay, there's crossing a threshold of sorts, but also that second point, and specifically for the boy, for the son, because now the son is keep in mind, back in the day, you look and you can see this in certain places, and our kids are spoiled, we take care of it, but you go to some countries where young children are the ones going to the, doing even you go to Yerushalayim, go to Mea Sha'arim, go to like place where like, in Mea Sha'arim, and like I lived there for like a few months, so I was in yeshiva there, and at like 10 at night, you see like the 7-year-olds, taking the 3-year-olds by hands, walking through the streets. They just came back from shopping. They're both carrying shopping bags, and the 7-year-old's in charge of the 3-year-old who also went shopping and went to go get the vegetables. That it's crazy, but that's because in certain societies that was the norm. The children grew up a lot faster than they do nowadays, given, okay? And when the male at a certain, the male needs the mother, but when the male no longer needs the mother, what happens? The mother is bye mom, bye. Dad is going to now teach this boy what he needs to become an adult, to become a contributing member to society. So mom, thank you for having a child. Thank you for nursing the child. Your job is done. See ya. And what they're celebrating, again, I wouldn't say in those words. I'm sorry if this is coming across as I'm being, whatever. But the point is that mother, who is in this context is like the child making machine, is done with her job, and now dad, who is the one who's going to raise this boy to be a boy, a man, it takes over. That's the celebration, okay? But you know what happens next in the following passage? Immediately afterwards, we find something very interesting, and that is that Yishmael, who is the older brother, who according to some would be 13 at this point, or maybe a little older, whatever it is, he goes ahead and he does some things which Sarah, Yitzchak's mother, does not like, and she feels are going to be harmful for her son Yitzchak. She tells her husband Avram, and Avram is very troubled by this. Now, with what we just said, let's bear the following in mind. They're living 4,000 years ago. They're living in a world where probably mom, in general, women in general have very little say, but we just had a whole celebration which basically told mom, see ya, go back to wherever you're going to be, but you are not, this is my son. Right? And she comes to Avram and says, Avram, look what's happening. Now, Avram, presumably, if Avram, we would expect to happen next, based on the social, historical milieu, is that, whatever the setting, is that Avram would say, okay, thank you, honey, maybe, if he was, and he'd say, thank you, go back. I got this. This is my son. These are my children. These are my sons. I got this. And you know what happens next? And that's probably what Avram's about to do. So much so that, what's needed? Is divine intervention. Because the next thing we find is the pasuk you're going to read, Vayomer Elokim. Okay, there's a few pasukim later. Vayomer Elokim El Avram. God appears to Avram. Avram's going to continue saying, okay, shkayach, thank you. But God appears to Avram and says, Al Yera Beinecha Al Anar Val Masecha. Okay, don't be distressed with the boy or your slave. Kol Asher Tomer Elecha Sarah Shma Bekola. Whatever Sarah says, listen to her. Those are bold words. Those are words which are like a shock to Avram. God had to intervene and say, listen to Sarah, that means that he would not have done it on his own. And there's not a criticism against Avram. Avram is a product of his society where, no, we literally just had a party saying, sorry, you're done. But nonetheless, God says, no, she's not. No, she's not. She is not just a baby-making machine. And let's look at the whole chapter, right? How does Avram describe his wife? In the immediate preceding chapter, as a sister. It's a utilitarian relationship where she is a sister. They have a familiar, respectful, loving. I'm sure, again, Avram, heaven forbid, Avram was not mean to her or disrespectful to her, but she is not an equal. She is not a co-parent. She is not a wife. She's not a partner. She is the mother. She's the mother. And she's my sister. And that's what Avram's saying in the passage before. She's my sister. She genuinely is my sister. I see her as my sister. And God comes along in this passage and says, Let's juxtapose these two passages. Let's say right after you describe her as your sister, she's going to give birth to a child. But it's not just your sister and utilitarian marriage, and she's a quote-unquote, making babies. No. Kol asher tomer elecha Sarah ishtecha tishma bekola. Whatever Sarah says, you listen to her voice. Because what God is introducing in those few words over there is a radical idea that the Torah picks up in this week's Parsha, which is that the relationship is not the relationship of a brother and a sister. The relationship is not one of absolute familiarity. It's not one of just having children. It's not one of just purely, again, utilitarianism and a platonic relationship. No. There is a sense of an equal. There's a sense of a partner. There's a sense of a mystery and awe and respect that is needed in the Jewish relationship. And in the story of Avram and Sarah, in those few words, in that small passage, God is introducing this radical idea into the world that that in the Jewish home, it is not one spouse one parent takes care of the child, both parents take care of the child. It's not that one parent, the father, is the one who makes all the decisions. No. Whatever Sarah says, you listen to her. Because what the Torah is introducing as for a relationship to flourish, there needs to be respect and awe and reverence between the two partners. And that's something that could only exist, suggest Cass, but I think the Torah, to me, to me, a more compelling argument is what the Torah again is introducing in the sexual forbidden relationships. What the Torah is telling us, again, according to the second view, is saying, yes, these things are forbidden, not because they are necessarily yeah, God ultimately came along and, created some biology where this kind of almost made it, that people would naturally abstain from such things. But not like Zeitlin was suggesting, that it's for the sake of maintaining the platonic and pure relationship, but on the contrary, it's to maintain and ensure that there's reverence, there is respect in the relationship, and that is the rationale behind the prohibitions. But through those prohibitions, I hope we could come to a better understanding of the Torah's view of the positive view of marriage, of that friction, positive friction, and that is that marriage is a union specifically between two strangers, specifically between two people who are really different than one another, which allows mystery, which then allows respect. Okay. Yes.